I was pregnant in 1997 with our first child, people asked, "Are you going to find out if it's a boy or it's a girl?" And I had heard a coworker several years prior to this saying there aren't many good surprises in life. And so she herself chose not to find out. And I just love that because ultrasounds were not invented to determine the so-called sex of the child. They were to look at abnormalities and any problems. And early ultrasounds, they would sometimes get it wrong. So I decided to wait. And we decorated our nursery in pastel, pink and blue and yellow and green. And people made us green and yellow colored blankets since we didn't know. And along came our bouncing baby boy, all decked out in all the blue things. And as he got older, we would go shopping and look for clothes. And he would say, "Mom, why are there no boys' clothes with flowers on them?" So you talk about kids being typical boys. I didn't know what they meant. My child would sit and look at a book. He loved the alphabet. We checked out books at the library all the time. He liked theater, which he did from 5 or 6 years old. He liked flowers. I remember when he was real little, he wanted to paint his nails. And as a child of the 70s and 80s, I was reluctant to do this, even though he was 3 or 4 years old. And looking back, I'm like, wow, why couldn't I allow that? What, cultural expectations were there that stopped me from doing that? And so I had my quiet, calm child who would sit and work on things quietly and peacefully. And then along came our second child 4 years later, and we had a bouncing baby girl. Again, I decided to not find out their assigned sex at birth. And she was decked out in pink. My grandmother, who crocheted, had an outfit waiting for the next girl to be born. And it was a pink hat and booties and jacket. And it was adorable. And people would say, "Is it a boy or a girl?" And I'm like, "I've got her decked out in pink." And she came along and she was rough and tumble. I remember when she was 2, her brother had a mullet and she grabbed him by the hair and would be pulling him. And of course, we were always, siding for her because she's 4 years younger. What are you doing to your little sister? But the little sister was the tough one. She was the kid who just walked across the toys in the floor room. She also enjoyed dance and ballet. She asked for a Bob the Builder doll one year for Christmas, and my dad got her a Wendy doll. And I know she was disappointed because she wanted the Bob the Builder doll, not the Wendy doll. She loved trucks. We went to a truck stop. We were traveling to family across states, and we stopped. And I remember you saw a female trucker there, and you walked over to talk to her. And our daughter was just fascinated with these kinds of things. And I remember thinking, I'm going to write a book called "My Son Likes Flowers and My Daughter Likes Trucks." And flash forward all these years, my son then later did Boy Scouts, which shocked many of his theater friends. And our daughter did dance and theater as well. And it just makes you stop and think about the gender stereotypes that exist and the expectations we put on children because we're all different. We're all different individuals.
Well, hello, this is Don.
And this is Gina with Focused Healthy Family.
And today this is podcast number 121. And we're talking about generational pride, being that it's Pride Month, I believe, this month. And so, but, before we get really too far into it, we're going to just take a little break for
We've got something new to share.
We're starting a new program. It's called Ask the OT, the occupational therapist, which is, of course, Gina. And we're going to be getting online and offering people to come in and join us to ask questions from an occupational therapist about senior care, we're really going to focus towards the sandwich generation and those taking care of aging parents.
Or aging loved ones of any sort. Sometimes it's a friend or other family member, but dealing with the challenges of aging, looking ahead. Maybe your parents fine right now, but you're concerned about the future. You live far away from them. What if this happens? Or you're in that place already. Mom fell and broke her hip, and you live 300 miles away. And what are you going to do? How are you going to help her? She's widowed, she's on her own. Visits to the hospital and rehab centers and the home setting and looking at different options. And mom just won't leave the house. She's going to just live there forever, and you're concerned about it. And so we're going to discuss these different topics, but we really want you to come on and join us and ask your questions. And we'll do live sessions. We're looking at twice a month.
They're frustrated. They're feeling sometimes a little bit hopeless because they don't know where to turn, what to do, and they've got a parent that's can be in crisis.
You can contact us live, or if you want to send a question, can send it anonymously. I deal with this every day when I'm at work. Family members coming in. Sometimes it's, well, we were looking at finding a different place to live, and then this happened. In different situations that come to me all the time and that I've been dealing with for years as an occupational therapist, working in primarily adult and geriatric rehab, and just all the different things that are entailed with that, as well as my personal experience from navigating this system. With my dad being in the hospital and having to go to rehab and having to advocate for him and help my mom through these processes. So I want to bring that personal and professional experience to everyone out there, because I know the baby boomers are growing, the largest growing population. And so it's many people, it's our parents or possibly grandparents in that situation. So please join us, like Don said.
Hey, this is Don. I wanted to jump in right here to let you know that Gina is going to be doing her first Q&A session April 2nd at 7 o'clock. And we're going to do it through our Focused Healthy Families e-Parent Club on Facebook. And it'll be live, but you can also join in via Zoom if you want to be part of it, or you can just watch it via the group. To become part of the e-Parent Club, it's $7.99 a month, and all you have to do is basically register. And once you get on, then you have twice a month we're going to do live Q&As like we're doing April 2nd. We also have different resources up there, articles, videos, a bunch of stuff about my tapping process. We'll have classes and workshops, plus connection with other people that are caregiving for their aging parent or loved one. And so you'll be connected with others that are up there, be able to communicate with them. Plus you have posting access to us, asking questions even on the post in the group, to be able to help you through this journey of caregiving for your aging parent or loved one. And so join us, join now, get part of the group. And like I said, April 2nd, then we'll have our first Q&A. But in the meantime, if you join, you can post questions up there on the group, and we'll be able to answer them via that platform. $7.99 per month gets you into the group as part of the group and connected with all the others that are there, plus connection with myself and with Gina, the OT at Ask the OT. Go to Focus Healthy Family, and you'll see a logo for Ask the OT. You can click there and register and join us for this wonderful event. And we're back.
We're back talking about, I came up with the title Generational Pride. And the reason for doing that is it is Pride Month, Don. June is National Pride Month. And I want to talk about what that means. I want to talk about gender stereotypes and across generations. And you growing up in the 60s and 70s and me in the 70s and 80s, and the different stereotypes that were out there and the different fears and labeling and bullying that went on. of people who were different, right? It's really about segregation and about um, discriminating against people, whether it's their skin color, their ethnicity, their accent, their background, their gender identity, their sexual orientation. There's so many different ways that people are discriminated against. And Pride is a celebration that we are all human. We're all human people and we need to respect everyone.
We're going to touch upon that's my little bit area. We're going to touch upon some of the disparities that a senior LGBTQ person goes through with healthcare, with different things. So we want to kind of talk on that too, just a little bit, at least touch on it, and then probably take that into another podcast as we go down the road with this.
And before we go there, Don, you said LGBTQ. And so what does that stand for?
Ah,
It stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, trans, queer, plus, because people identify in many different ways. And you might ask, why so many different identities? And yet, I believe that as people, we are evolving to acknowledge our differences and own who we are and realize that gender is not binary, that we're not either all male or all female, and that we can embrace different aspects of ourselves. I've been a member of PFLAG for a number of years. PFLAG is Parents and Friends of Lesbians and Gays. It was an organization founded some time ago. I don't have that readily at my fingertips, but it's the nation's largest organization dedicated to supporting, educating, and advocating for LGBTQ plus people and those who love them. So it's an organization of support. If you go to their website, you can find resources, you can find about meetings, you can see how they connect with the community.
well, and one thing we just recently went to a Pride event, and I was talking to somebody there, and I had an interesting conversation with somebody, and it's something I realized some time back as we see this coming about in society. I started to kind of do some research, look it up, and kind of try to understand it. And one of the things that I really liked about it actually was I think it's finally defining us human beings in the right way, versus like you say, binary, male, female, and that's the only description. We have in us, we have the chromosomes or the genes or whatever of both male and female, and it just what balance of that is not, there's no set balance that if you're male you have all of this and none of this or any of that. It- um and it just started making sense that we're actually defining defining ourselves in reality and what we really are. We're just a mix of different types of genders, different type of, I don't know how to put this. Do you understand, get what I'm saying?
Yes, so let me back up a minute. And so I want to identify we have gender identity and we have our sexual identity, and then we have our gender expression. I've learned this from different classes I've taken and things as someone who chooses to be an ally, meaning I support all people. I'm really about supporting all people. Um, so sexual identity is when at birth we are assigned a sex. And what are we assigned it based on? It's not assigned based even on chromosomes. If you have a certain body part or you don't, you're a boy, you're a girl. And not a very scientific method to be, in my opinion. And yet society is labeling that. And you can argue this in multiple ways, but just to differentiate. So your sexual identity is who you're attracted to, who you love, who you're romantically interested in, who you find appealing. Your gender identity, our gender is how we relate in the world. So that's different from sexual identity. It's when I get dressed up in a pretty dress and do my hair, I'm expressing my feminine side and I like to feel pretty uh, and so that's kind of an expression of my gender identity. I identify as female and I enjoy getting dressed up. And at other times, I am out mowing the grass in my cutoff shirt and my shorts, and I like doing yard work. And someone might say, well, that's very masculine, right? So um, I I can express my gender in different ways. And so some people, we tend to think things are binary. You're a boy, you're a girl. And even like gay or straight, like we've come to accept that some people are gay. Um, our culture as a whole, I will say. And so even within that community, it's like, what do you mean? You like both boys and girls, or what do you mean you identify as, not interested in either? There's many terminology, and this can get quite lengthy, but you can look up resources for it. But some people don't feel sexual attraction to either sex. Some people feel romantically attracted to all people. And it's really a matter of perspective and openness. And why do we have to have labels? Well, because inherently in our culture, people get labeled. They assume because you're a boy, they assume this because you're a girl. And so the young people today are identifying, well, you know what? That doesn't fit with me. And if you want to stick me in a category, I'm going to create my own category. And so it's really about embracing many different expressions. Thus, the LGBTQ plus means however you identify yourself. And so looking at that perspective of that.
Well, I think we need, as human beings, we need definitions for things. We need things need to be defined for us in this physical format that we have. It kind of goes. This goes a little deeper, but it goes into the idea of the non-physical versus the physical. And in the physical, you need. That's kind of why we're in the physical, is for definitions. In the non-physical world, we just know everything. Down here, we need to feel it, touch it, be in. So we need definitions to ourselves, to things, to.
I'm going to back up. Sorry if you're hearing background noise. Don and I decided to sit on our front porch,
And she's sitting
affectionately
this way to me, so I'm not sitting in front of. So is that,
affectionately known as my office. And backing up to gender expression and gender identity. So I was the story I told talking about that my son wanted to wear things with flowers. He dressed up as Amelia Bedelia, and you know, our daughter liked dresses, and she also wanted to play with trucks in the dirt. And it's becoming more common, especially with my generation, Generation X, and how we're raising our children, and definitely generations younger than me, to allow our children to cross gender lines. Because if we teach our boys that they need to be tough and they can't cry and they can't play with dolls, and then we wonder why they're not nurturing as men and adults,
yeah,
and we teach our girls to be quiet and to listen and behave and sit down and be a good girl, we're teaching them submission and taking away their power to be who they are. And so we have to look back, over generations. Um, and obviously, there's extremes on both ends. And I'm looking kind of at the middle ground that over time, there always have been LGBTQ plus people. They have
yeah.
existed forever. For so long, they weren't accepted. I mean, we could go back in history. We could do a whole nother podcast on the history of it. That if you look way back in time, um, people have always existed that identified in different ways. I looked up things about indigenous cultures and how trans women were honored and revered because they were born into this male body, so to speak, and yet embodied feminine. And you can look over the history of things in different cultures across different cultures, and it's really a matter more of acceptance. Just like we went through issues with the skin color of people, and how people were thought less than because of this color of their skin. Uh, there's a similarity here that people are, I mean, part of it, let's call it what it is a religious belief that you are either male or female, and that God says that only males and females can be together.
Well, and they make God a male so most of the time too.
So over the course of generations, there's been different levels of acceptance of gender identity, gender expression, different levels of understanding, just like we've come to understand science in new levels. We recently went to the Civil War Museum up in Gordonsville, Virginia, and how science has evolved. At the time of the Civil War and the Civil War Museum that I went to, it turned this hotel built just before the start of the Civil War got turned into like a makeshift hospital, kind of a triage location. And at the time, they didn't know basically basic hygiene. Washing your hands would prevent so much infection. They learned that if you cut off an injured limb, then the person was more likely to survive. They didn't even understand that it had to do with infection and disease, right? So over time, we've learned more. We've come to new understandings about all kinds of topics. And so we've come to better understanding of how people identify and how realizing that we put people into categories. And is that really fair to make those assumptions? Is it fair to children that all the little boys' clothes has trucks and footballs and basketballs, and the little girl stuff has unicorns and is pastel colored? Because a child who then doesn't have that interest, then they feel awkward. They feel not accepted. They're immediately said, "Oh, you like that? Well, you're not supposed to." They might come into a family that's accepting and loving and embracing. And yes, there are more gender neutral clothing out there. And yet, walk into a baby child's department of any basic chain store, and it's going to be divided, into boys and girls. And as adults, yes, men and women are shaped differently. And so we need different clothing styles. And there are those aspect of things. But when you're talking babies and toddlers, I mean, they're round, chunky blobs if they're healthy. And it's shaped that different. And so really it's a matter of we want to define them. We want to announce to the world, just like when I covered my daughter in pink and I wondered why people asked, is it a boy or a girl? I'm like, she's pink from head to toe. But now it's like, I'm grateful that they asked because they didn't make an assumption. And
No.
that's really a kind thing to do. And yet, the question, oh, you're having a baby. Is it a boy or a girl? Let's have a gender reveal party. And it's like, let's have a celebration of life that you have a happy, healthy baby. Why do we have to put so much labels on kids even before they're born? Rant
Well,
over about that.
what do
So
you?
understanding differences with gender identity and accepting people and realizing that we put expectations on people without thinking about it. Go ahead.
I have room. Can I come in here? Uh, well, and you talked about, I run into a lot in my practice and the people I work with, especially, like I say, majority women that I call it they lost their voice. Their voice was taken from them as a child, just like you were talking about, taking the power away. In taking the power away, a lot of times you take away the voice too. And so I have to work with them in regaining that voice because like you say, they're taught at a very young age to be quiet, you know. And boys are too, in a way of, big boys don't cry, kind of scenario, that they're taught how to be the binary boy or girl, and I think we need to teach differently.
I talked about my son liking flowers, wanting to paint his nails. He dressed up as Amelia Bedelia, and my concerns about letting him paint his nails. And yet, girls who like to play in the mud and be rough, they're tomboys, and that's a culturally accepted thing for the most part. And yet, what do boys get called? I mean, in the 70s and 80s, they were called sissies. They were called gay. I mean, and that was used as a slur.
Faggot was another one,
And
that
those are
was a,
slurs that
yeah.
we will not speak, Don. There are words that are
Well,
not culturally accepting to speak. And like the gay community took back the word queer. It used to be a slur, and they decided, you know what, we're taking that word back. And so I've learned these things from my children and understanding this and respecting differences. And it's partly about the language we use. So looking at, the expectations of boys versus girls and things that boys are allowed and just that difference. So if you have a son like I did, and luckily we grew up in a community of supportive people and it never was a problem for us as parents, other than not me not wanting to paint his fingernails, but we were fine that he loved theater and he enjoyed all those things. And he also was running around kissing girls in preschool. And it's all encompassing, right? He is a straight male this day, and yet you put expectations on children, just like we think, oh, they're really into science and figuring things out. They're going to be an engineer. And we put that expectation out there on this child, or based on some behaviors when they're young. And so we just need to really stop and ask ourselves, what are we doing? How are we labeling people? And what kind of expectations and how is that affecting people and their feelings? And it affects how we communicate with people. So when you think across generations, when you have grandparents and trying to understand this, and you might have a family and they have a child who comes out as gay and they worry about talking to the grandparents and talking to other family members and who's going to accept them. And we have to realize people grew up in different generations with different expectations. And so we need to realize where they're at, and they also too can grow from where they are, and there's ways to educate them and ways to share information without just saying, oh, you don't know, you're just old and you you don't, creating that gender divide rather than embracing it and respecting we've all grown up with in different ways and need to honor that. And talking about the older generation and how that this comes to be effective in the LGBT community. I work for a wonderful local continuous care retirement facility, and they became SAGE certified. And I became fascinated by this, and I discovered what this all meant. And it is a SAGE training is a training that they do for SAGE credential indicates that SAGE care leadership or certified trainers have trained an agency's staff on LGBTQ plus aging cultural competency, and credentials are earned annually. And so this is specific to communities of seniors, whether it be nursing homes, senior living centers, assisted living centers. To my knowledge, they might span beyond that, but the place that I work, and realizing and respecting differences and understanding how it might be different for different individuals. And we'll share a link for Sage Care, sageusa.care, to learn more about that. You can actually find facilities if you have a loved one or know someone who is looking for a place and they want to feel safe and comfortable there because the senior might be in that community, in the LGBTQ plus community, that you can find an accepting place. And so looking at seniors, like Don did some research here. Share with us, Don.
Okay. Well, it's just what you know, the idea of SAGE is training the caregivers, to not have these things, these disparities that an LGBTQ senior, and I think any LGBTQ person runs into these disparities, but it gets even more intense for a senior. Uh, they, they have, it's, I think, kind of starts out with they have a higher, uh, the mental care is where they get left out. And
So are you reading is there research from a particular article, Don,
oh
that you,
yeah, that's true. It's article Seeking to Live with Pride and Dignity: Health Disparities Faced by Older LGBTQ IA plus Americans. I'm not sure what the IA stands for in it. By Katrin Warner Perez. It was June 6, 2024. And she talks about higher rates of mental health disparities compared to their heterosexual and cisgender counterparts. The persistent stigma, the systematic discrimination, and the isolation is a big one. And we learned about isolation about over COVID and how detrimental that is to anybody. But when you're talking about this group, it makes it even worse.
Well, because if they grew up in the 40s, the 50s, those time periods, they
You couldn't even talk about it. You
it,
couldn't bring it up.
it
You
or
couldn't live it.
depending on the circle of where they lived very differently about it. They sometimes had marriages and both their spouse knew they were gay or whatever, and that they had to come to a different way of living about it, or they had to live secretly. And that's why you have older people now coming out because now they feel it's safe to after all these years.
Yeah.
And so, just imagining what it's like to grow up in that context and the difficulty with that.
Well, and then, of course, working in the field that I do and working with patients, I've realized how much the whole thing I'm working on is the mindset and how it affects the physical. Well, of course, then that having those mental disparities then can lead to the physical aspects of going, and their chronic conditions such as cardiovascular disease, diabetes, and arthritis are also more frequently reported among the LGBTQ adults. Um, and then of course they have HIV and AIDS still play a role in it, even though there's been a lot of research and a lot of work done in that area. It still plays a role in bisexual or gay community. And then, trying to get health insurance. They talk about in this article the fact that most healthcare, more so now it's changing, but came from the employer. And if that employer didn't respect, like same-sex marriages or had some prejudice to them, they wouldn't be able to get the health care that they needed. Um, and so, they also, it talks about facing discrimination at work or trying to find work, lower earning possibilities, um, and lack of access to safe and affordable housing, which I never didn't realize that would be an issue. Um, so having all these kind of discrepancies as discriminations, they tend to delay or avoid getting medical attention because they're of the fear that of discrimination, the fear of being how they're going to be treated. And so at the same time, then it leads to they get less of the early detection of problems. And so it can lead to poor health just because of that. Um, and they're just worried about inferior care overall. Um, and then they in the article, it doesn't go too far into it, but it talks about then you add in LGBTQ and then adding in whether you're a person of color or, even I think they talked a little bit about, um, if you're Asian or,
Different ethnicity.
yeah, there you go. And that then adds to these disparities. So
And
I don't know,
different
it's kind of
different cultures
interesting.
have different levels of acceptance
Yeah,
with these disparities. And some cultures and countries are more accepting, and others are strictly against it in a it's punishable. It can result in death of the person if they are out in some countries and communities. And so, yeah, you have all those different factors playing in a role. And so the older we are, the longer we've lived through different phases of this, it carries that weight around. And just so for all of us who are not in the LGBT community, the understanding of it and our own beliefs and stereotypes and our intrinsic bias based on how we grow up and what we've been exposed to. I wanted to just step back, Don. You talked about cisgender. I just wanted to
yeah,
define. So someone who's cisgender is they identify as the gender that aligns with their um, gender assigned at birth. So I was born a female because of what body parts I had, and I identify as female, and therefore I'm cisgendered, as opposed to someone who is born female, but they don't identify as either male or female, and that's where you get the non-binary. And sometimes these people might feel more feminine on some days and wear a dress, and on other days they feel more masculine. It can manifest in different ways. Someone who is transgender identifies as a different gender than what they were assigned at birth. And again, gender identity is separate from sexual identity. Won't get into all that in great detail, but just understanding what these terms mean. And so if you're cisgender, you are the gender that you were assigned. Everyone thinks you're a female, your anatomy says you're a female, you feel like a female. That's the cisgender, as opposed to the other gender identities. And
Well,
again, this is new, even though I've learned about it and I've had conversations with my kids who are in the, Generation Z, keeping up with the names of the generations, and they've grown up with an understanding of it, and they've been exposed to these ideas and these areas of acceptance that we were not, growing up. It was.
well, you know what I find interesting is that as I grew up, it came about to know yourself. That was kind of the um,
What time period are you talking about,
well,
Don?
probably 70s. You know, they the psychedelic
The hippie,
drugs and things like that.
well,
The
the hippie
hippie,
movement, and
was
and women's rights was a part of that. The women's
yeah.
rights movement.
So it was a message of getting to know who you are, which at the was a tough one for people to really grasp a lot of times. What do you mean that, because we went by the gut versus the spirit or the heart or whatever, not the gut, but the mind, logically. But I think that's just coming to fruition now that this is how we get to really know ourselves, is how we truly are, not just some either this or that. We are a mix of things, and I think that's kind of neat. It's an evolution of that idea.
And that speaks to what I think of as acceptance and letting go of expectations. So we have to recognize we have expectations when we meet people. We have expectations of how they're going to act, whether it's going to the doctor's office and how the doctor's going to act versus the nurse. And you might interact with each of them differently. Your expectations of when you go to the grocery store and you're buying groceries, the expectations you have of your children. The closer people are to us emotionally, the stronger those expectations can be. And we need to stop and think about expectations that we're putting on others. And is that really helping to empower them, or is it limiting them?
Yeah.
And then acceptance. We accepting all people are different. If we were all the same and had the same beliefs and the same system of the world would be rather boring, and how would we learn to experience new and different things? And so we need to think about, what are we accepting and how are we expressing that acceptance of other people? Years ago, when I was early in the homeschooling years, I in the South, in North Carolina, homeschooling my children, and there are a large percentage of people who do it for religious reasons. I remember meeting a mom who said she didn't want her kids to learn that it was okay to be gay, and therefore she didn't want them to go to public school. And I remember thinking, I will never have more interactions with this person because I'm not homeschooling for that reason. I'm homeschooling to give my kids more opportunity and to embrace that acceptance of all people. I was meeting with a group of other homeschooling moms. I ran a homeschooling website, and so I was always looking to connect people. And we got together with some other moms, and I remember them talking about that I have gay friends and I have lots of gay friends, and I'm fine with people who are gay, but I teach my child that in our family, we don't do that. I'm like, what? Okay. I can understand that people with their religious beliefs make this statement, but it's okay if other people are gay, but it's not okay if your child is. Like, really thinking about that. What kind of message is, sending your child that, well, our beliefs say that we don't do that, but it's okay that other people are. So in one ways, that's an acceptance of other people. And yet you are putting expectation on your child, which of course you could argue we won't get into the whole religious component of this, but expecting your child to follow a certain path that you prescribe is when they are reaching the age of gaining their own independence and they're education is taking them into other areas that you might not understand because times are changing and there's more information and education and it's more readily available, that there might be a point where they question the way they were raised and their beliefs. And that really is important. If we as young adults didn't question things, we wouldn't make change in the world. New things wouldn't happen if people didn't question. If you didn't question, oh, gee, we're riding on a horse and it gets hard to get from here to there, but that's the way it is. And that's the way we always do it. You wouldn't have invented the motor vehicles. And so that questioning, that exploration, that rejecting things they feel that are not working is really a part of the human experience and a part of a child growing up. And you look at talking about teenagers and they're rebelling and all this, they're gaining their independence, they're figuring out their place in the world. And kids who are brought up in an environment of respect and allowed to explore and in a safe, healthy environment, you can still do that. You can still have boundaries and limitations within your family. But if you have an environment of openness and discussion, you're less likely to have that kid who just takes off and rejects everything, runs away, breaks from the family. This is why suicide is such an epidemic in this country for children and teens and young adults, because depression and links to lack of acceptance across many different areas, and even more so for LGBTQ plus youth. And so we need to stop and question ourselves sometimes and, think about what we're saying to people, think about the interactions we have. And even if it's just an observing of someone else's conversation, just asking ourselves those difficult questions of what really matters to us? And if accepting and teaching our children's love and to understand other people and obviously, if you don't believe those things, you probably haven't listened to our podcast very long because
Well, and
that's
I think
kind of the nature of things here is respect and respect for all people of different ages and cultures and identities. And it kind of boils down to respect once again.
well, and I think it's also more about the parent than it is about anything. I think they have, and it's not easy to do, but they have to explore their own, what they're putting these expectations on. What is it about them? What is it they're thinking? And a lot of times it's coming from how they learned and what their parents did and all that.
And
And
not
they have to kind of address that and look at that too, if they're up to it. That's another,
Well, and we need to honor, okay, my parents grew up, they were born in the early 40s. They grew up in the 50s, and so they were born before the baby boom. So they're kind of the end of the silent generation, kind of early baby boomers. And so they didn't quite grow up with the hippie movement of things. It was much more the 40s and 50s was their youth years. And I have to recognize the culture in which they grew up, in which they lived. And I need to honor and accept that. And I can also educate and share information, with them, which I've done over the years. And so there's a matter of acceptance of where people are at and education and also setting those boundaries. So there's just so many components to talk about here, but we wanted to celebrate Pride Month in a way that honors acceptance of people and to give you some information. And we'll have links to a lot of these websites and things we mentioned and organizations that support LGBTQIA plus individuals and their identities. And so you can learn more yourself and you can understand. And if you have a senior that you're helping to find support for, that there are different resources that you can do to help get them support, just like there are for youth. If you are in the greater Charlotte area, Time Out Youth is an amazing organization to help support LGBTQ plus youth from, I think it's age 12 through 23. They have free counseling services. They have a number of different support and services. PFLAG organizations are across the country. They might even be outside the United States. And they're places you can get information, support group meetings. They do educational workshops and information. They go into communities and schools and other places. And
they mentioned in this article about a podcast called This is Growing Old, and they mention specific episodes of it. There's one, Aging with Pride, with Marianne Adams, uh, who is of Zambi Nobla, National Organization of Black Lesbians and Aging. And then they talk about an episode called Celebrating Pride Month with Michael Adams, CEO of the Sage that you talked about. So just they, like I said, growing old. This is Growing Old podcast is what they meant.
And I'm going to wrap it up. Kathy Adams from Zen Parenting Radio, ZPR, a favorite podcast of ours. We got to interview Kathy ourselves talking about sandwich generation, and you can subscribe to her, and she sends out a weekly thought. And this one was Parenting and Pride. And I'm going to quote some things from her. Identification is a living language that's not limited to 5 letters, and our work as parents and allies is to listen and learn so we can respect each person's story and how they identify. Again, this is from Kathy Cassini Adams. She's a licensed clinical social worker. She's co-author of the Zen Parenting Radio. Her and her husband run that. But I read her post today that she sends out via email. It's just a short little read, and she covers many different topics. And I'm just going to highlight some of the things she said, because it's kind of what inspired this topic today. But, allowing your children to tell you who they are rather than dictating what's expected of them gives them the freedom to appreciate and understand who they truly are. She talks about LGBTQ+ community is incredibly diverse. And the lists of terminologies, they use the plus sign to indicate, to include everyone. And it's not just limited to those letters like we talked about before, about embracing all people and all identity. And in realizing people don't like being labeled, and so they find their ways that they can identify with so that they can relate and connect with other people. And she talks about talking about gender and identity and sexual identity and helping children to understand that. And there's lots of information on there as well. And just talking about the differences that things are now as opposed to when we were growing up. She's of my generation, X generation, or Don is really the end of the baby boomer generation, and understanding the differences. I'm going to quote her again because she's such a good writer. Human beings have paradoxical aspects that demands specificity and understanding. While the ideal is to practice humility and to celebrate and learn, the very least we can do is to choose to do no harm. When we step over that line into harming others, whether it's through legislation, limiting rights, or simply refusing acceptance because we think we're superior, we lose touch with our humanity. And on that note, thank you, Kathy Adams from Zen Parenting Radio. And thank you for joining us here on our Focused Healthy Family podcast. We hope you've enjoyed it. We hope that you can maybe have learned something new, even if you don't choose to attend a Pride celebration. Or if you want to embrace it, check out local Pride celebrations. June every year is Pride Month. And there are other areas like Charlotte does their Pride celebration in August. We'd love to hear from you. We'd love to hear your comments and your feedback. Be sure to let us know. Connect with us on Facebook, on Instagram, and you can view us on YouTube if you're listening to this via podcast, as well as wherever you hear your podcast. Please let other people know about us. Check out our Ask the OT that we are doing several times a month to answer questions about caring for aging loved ones. And learn more about all we have going on and connect with Don and I as I'm doing consults for people caring for aging loved ones and the work Don does with tapping.
And on the next Ask.
The OT is on July 1st, 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, and then July 10th at 12 noon Eastern Standard Time. We do that via YouTube. If you want to be part of it, reach out to us ahead of time because we do it Zoom through YouTube. So you could join us on the Zoom channel to be live. You can connect on when we do the event on YouTube and ask questions that way. You can submit questions in advance. You can view previous episodes to look at things that we've already talked about.
And remember, how you speak to your children and your family shapes their future and yours.